So today's lesson is similar to the last video you watched. We're still going to be writing methods and writing hierarchy charts to back those up. But this time, focus is on these things called accumulators. And basically, what an accumulator is, you're going to use these a bunch this year. You can see right there, accumulators. It's a variable that adds on to another variable, so it keeps going up. Okay, so we're going to start easy, write a hierarchy chart in code that will add the numbers from 1 to 10 and output the sum. So again, like the first one we did last time, the easy option would just be to do sum equals 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 all the way up to 10. But if I ask you 1 to a million, you're not going to do that. So how would I go from 1 to 10? Every number as I go, add it on to what's already there. That's the perfect case for an accumulator. So that's what you want to think about when you make your hierarchy chart. So I'm not going to make different variables for 1 to 10. What can we use that's going to start at 1 and go all the way up till 10, hitting every number in between as we go? Hopefully you're thinking for loop. So what do you want to call this method? Let's call it total. Or you could say sum 10 or whatever you want to call it. But the first thing in this method is going to be a for loop. And that for loop is going to be running 10 times. And I need to have a variable called sum, and sum is going to equal whatever the sum was before. The purpose of having this loop is so that, like, when I is 1, I can add 1 onto it. When I is 2, I can add 2 onto it. When I is 3, I can add 3 onto it, all the way up till when I is 10, I can add 10 onto it. So I'm just going to write, you could write sum plus I or sum plus whatever loop variable you use. And that's your hierarchy chart. Code. Okay, so there's no get num or get info this time. So we're going to start right with public void total. Remember your double parentheses after a method name. Inside here we have a for loop. So for int I equals 1 is the first number we want to add, so start at 1. Go as long as I is less than or equal to 10, because 10 is the last number you want to add. I plus plus. Okay, so inside here we have to accumulate onto sum. Our accumulator is this variable sum. Now as soon as I write sum here, if I was in Eclipse right now, I would have a problem. My problem would be that sum hasn't been defined as a variable. So you need to define any variable that you use. I don't have to do it with I, because technically I'm defining I inside this for loop. Int I, that's defining I. But sum's never been defined. Is it an int? Is it a double? Well, in this case it should be a double, or an int, sorry. So at the top of your code, squeeze it in if you didn't leave yourself room. Make sure you write int sum. And if you're going to accumulate onto it, you kind of want to accumulate onto some initial value. What would you want sum to start at? Well, if I'm just adding onto it, we'd want it to equal 0. So set it equal to 0 to begin with. Notice a single equals, because we're not checking if it's equal, we're setting it equal. Okay, now down here, I could write sum equals sum plus I, but actually the faster and kind of the more, the nicer way to do it is just write plus equals. So I'm actually going to erase that. If I write sum plus equals I off to the right here, I'll put a comment. That's the same as saying sum equals sum plus I. So this is kind of redundant, saying take what sum was and add I to it. If I do plus equals, then I can add I onto what sum already was. Now remember, this will add up the numbers, and that's what this will do, and output the sum. And we want the output to go after the for loop, because I want it to do all the addition first, and then when I'm totally done, still inside the method though, We're going to write system.out.print sum. That's our method. So obviously this would be really easy to change if I wanted to add the numbers from 1 to 1,000,000. I could just put 1,000,000 here. Or even if I wanted to add the numbers from 50 to 500, we could start I at 50, go up to 500. Okay, any questions on that one? Remember, just raise your hand if you're watching it in class, or put a note on the paper if you're watching this at home and you have a question, and I will answer it for you as soon as I can. Okay, number 2, we're going to write a hierarchy chart and code that will take the test score of 5 different students and output the class average. Okay, so now this is a little trickier. We've got to get these 5 test scores. So let's call this, I'm just going to make one big method. Let's call it calc average. And kind of a clunky way to do this would be to say system.out.print, enter score 1. Score 1 equals in.nextIn. System.out.print, enter score 2. Score 2 equals in.nextIn. And I could do that, but again, if I have a class of like 20 students or something, that'd be obnoxious. I don't actually care about the individual scores. All I care about is the class average. So how do you find an average? Well, typically you take all the numbers you want to average up, add them up, and divide by the number that you have. So what I really need is an accumulator that's going to total up all these averages that get read in. And at the end, I'll take that total and divide by, in this case, 5. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make a for loop running 5 times, because there's 5 students. For each student, I want to do get score. And I could write a method called, public void get score and put that right inside this for loop, but I'm going to write out the whole code this time. Then after I get that score, I'm going to accumulate onto the variable called total. So if I do total equals total plus score, that's what has to happen for every individual person. Now at the end of that for loop, after it runs 5 times, we'll have the total of all the scores. So outside the for loop, we can make another variable called average and take the total divided by 5. And then we want to print it out also. So we're going to print average at the end. Okay, so let's try to write this code. All right, so first think, are there any variables that we're going to need? Well, there's a couple. We're going to need a variable, at least temporarily, to read in the score from the keyboard. So let's make that an int score. And I don't know if it said here, and I didn't say that the scores couldn't be decimals, but I don't give half points because it makes my grade book look ugly, so assume they're all integers. So what type of variable would total be? Well, if all the scores, individual scores are integers, when you add integers, you get integers. So total will be an integer also. So int total. And that's going to be our accumulator. So we want to start that at 0 so that I have something that I can accumulate onto. And then what type of variables should average be? Now, even though all of their scores are ints, the average could still be a double. Like if one person got a 50 and one person got a 51, the average would be 50.5. So we do need to make average a double. Okay, so now we're ready to make the method called calc average. So public void calc average. And the first thing in calc average is a for loop. We're going to ask them to read in the score, and then we're going to accumulate it onto that total. So this for loop starts with int I equaling 1. Basically just using this to count 5 times. So I is less than or equal to 5. I plus plus. And ask them to put in the score. So system.out.print quotes enter score. A semicolon at the end of that. And then remember, you're reading in from the keyboard, so they're going to type in the score. They have to save that temporarily in this variable called score. So we're going to have score equals in.nextInt. We put double parentheses and a semicolon after that. And I know in order to use that, you need that line up at the top of your program, keyboard in, system in, that thing. Assume that that's already there. I'm not going to make you memorize how to write that out. Okay, so this score, next time the for loop runs, score is going to get overwritten with a new score. So I don't care about the individual, but I do care about that onto the total. So here's where I accumulate. And I could write total equals total plus score, or the new way I showed you is just to write total plus equals score. Okay, so that's going to happen 5 times. At the end of that, we can calculate the average. So I'm setting average equal. That's why there's a single equals here. How do I calculate the average? Well, we take the total, divide it by the number of scores, which we know is 5. And then at the end, we want to print out the average. So system.out.print average. Oops, gotta make that lowercase. Average is not in quotes because that's a variable. And then we can end the public void. Now I kind of intentionally made 2 mistakes in that code. One of them I hope you're able to catch. If you can catch what my first mistake was, it was right near the beginning. So this line, when you have calc av, there needs to be a double parentheses after that. Now, the other one is a much more subtle one that's easy to mess up, and a lot of you are going to mess this up over and over again throughout comp sci 1 and 2. There is one other issue. Average isn't going to actually calculate correctly. Does anyone see why? It's because of integer division. Total's an int, and 5's an int. Int divided by int always gives you an int. So my example earlier, if someone was 50 and 51, total would be 101. 101 divided by 5, it's going to just lop off the decimal. Even though average is a double, it's just going to make it 0.0, regardless of what the decimal is. So if I want to actually make this calculate it correctly, either total or 5 has to be a double. And we could cast it as a double. The easiest way to do it is turn 5 into 5.0. So just write total divided by 5.0. And make yourself a note here, because again, a lot of you will mess this up, if not all of you. Need double in order to work right or calculate correctly. All right, so before we turn it over and do the last one, if you got any questions, especially in that double thing, because that is tricky, raise your hand or write an extra note in your class notes so that I can help you on that. Okay, when you are ready to go on, flip it over. And here's the last one. Adjust the code from number 2 to first ask the user for the number of students in the class, and then make all necessary changes in order to output the class average. Okay, so basically this is going to be the same as the last one, so I'm not going to make a new hierarchy chart. I'll have to add a variable for num students, and I'll have to ask for that first. The for loop will run that many times instead of 5. And to find the average, I'm going to have to divide by the number of students instead of 5. But otherwise, pretty similar. So the big difference, like I just said, is that we have a variable called num students. That would obviously be an integer. Don't have to set that equal to 0 or anything because it's not an accumulator. I'm still going to have int score to read in everyone's individual score. We're still going to have our accumulator. Int total equals 0. And we're still going to have the method for the average, or the variable for the average, and that's a double. Okay, so then here's our code. Public void, calc average, double parentheses, not forgetting that this time. Before I can make a for loop, I got to know how many times that for loop needs to run. So we've got to ask, please enter the number of students. So that's a system.out.print. Enter num of students. Those are in quotes. Don't forget the next line. In order to save that number that's entered in, we got to put it in a variable. So num students equals in dot next int, because it's an integer that I'm adding. Okay, next up, we got to get all the scores. So what do I need for that? For loop. I want I to start at 1 again, because I'm just counting however many times I need. I want I to be less than or equal to what? Well, it depends on how many students are in the class. That's what that variable num students is for. So you can throw that variable right there. I plus plus. Okay, inside here is pretty much the same as the last page. We're going to ask for the score. So system.out.print quotes enter score. And then we're going to have score equals in.next int again. Accumulate that onto the total so that I can find the average. So total plus equals score. And that's going to happen for as many students as I say I have. Afterwards, we're going to calculate the average. And like always, we take the total of all the values I'm averaging and divide it by the number that I have. So how many number of scores, or how many scores did I actually total up? Well, whatever num students was. So I have to do total divided by num students. And then don't forget I want to print out the average in the end. So we need a system.out.print. And let's label it too. So I'm going to say average equals, that's going to be in quotes. End the quotes, and then I want to print out the variable average. So remember, anytime I switch from writing words to variables, I need a plus. And then we're going to print out the variable average, which doesn't go in quotes because that's a variable. And there's our code. All right, now, again, I didn't make any little syntax errors, at least not that I'm aware of, but there is one issue with this code. Anyone see what it is? It's the calculation of average again. It's the old integer division thing. We've got total divided by num students. Total is an int, num students is an int. So I have the same exact problem as last time, int divided by int. So it's not going to calculate a decimal correctly. Now last time, to fix that, I just made the number I was dividing by a double by adding a 0.0 onto it, and that was great. But this time, I'm not dividing by a number. They're two variables. So what could I do? Well, there's two options. You could cast it as a double. So let's say I wanted to cast total as a double. I could write double, don't write this, and then total in parentheses. So that would make total, if it was 5, now it's 5.0, because it gets casted as a double, and then that'll do the correct division. But probably the faster way to do it is just to go up here and make either total or num students a double. Total probably be better to make a double because num students we're using inside a for loop. So let's make total a double. So it doesn't really matter that that's an int. And if we just make it a double up here, then that'll fix this problem. This is a double now, divided by an integer. It's going to give me a decimal that's correct. Okay, so make sure you wrote that down. We made the accumulator a double. And that was just, again, in order to make that division work correctly. All right, again, if you have any questions, please call me over and ask me. Otherwise, you're done with this video as well. So have me check off your notes so that you can get credit for it and go on to your next assignment. Good luck.